HistoryTube presents The Viking Sagas, Part 2, The Great Heathen Army. For almost 70 years, the people of England had learned to fear the Vikings. They came from the sea. They struck monasteries, towns, and isolated settlements. They took silver, slaves, and anything else they could carry. And then they disappeared. But in the year 865, something changed. The Vikings came to England, and this time they stayed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called them the Great Heathen Army. Over the next 14 years, this army would kill kings, destroy kingdoms, and conquer much of England. And according to later legend, among its leaders were the sons of perhaps the most famous Viking of them all, Ragnar Lothbrok. But separating that legend from history is not easy, because the real story of the Great Heathen Army may be even more extraordinary. In 865, there was no single kingdom of England. Instead, the country was divided between several competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In the north was Northumbria. Across the Midlands lay Mercia. To the east was East Anglia, and dominating the south was Wessex. These kingdoms fought one another almost as readily as they fought outsiders, and for decades, Scandinavian raiders had exploited those divisions. But Viking warfare itself was changing. What had begun with relatively small coastal raids had grown into increasingly large military expeditions. Then, in 865, a Viking force landed in East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described it simply as a great army. These men had not crossed the North Sea merely to raid a monastery. They had come prepared to campaign. The Vikings spent the winter in East Anglia, where they obtained horses. Then they rode north. Their target was one of the richest cities in Anglo-Saxon England, York. Northumbria was already trapped in a civil war between two rival kings, Ælla and Osbert. The Vikings captured York in November 866. The two Northumbrian rivals apparently put aside their differences and attempted to retake the city. They failed. Both kings were killed. Within roughly a year of arriving in England, the Great Army had shattered one of its major kingdoms, and scarily enough, this was only the beginning. And among the Viking commanders associated with this extraordinary campaign are names which would become legendary: Ivar, Halfdan, and later Ubba, which brings us to Ragnar. If you've watched our previous video on the Viking Sagas, or watched the TV series Vikings, or read the later Norse sagas, you already know the story. Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking warrior, is captured by King Ælla of Northumbria. Ælla throws him into a pit filled with snakes, and as Ragnar dies, he warns that his sons will avenge him. Those sons then gather a colossal army, invade England, and subject Ælla to a horrifying execution, known as the Blood Eagle. It is an incredible story. The problem is that we don't know how much of it actually happened. Sources written much closer to the invasion tell us about Viking leaders whose names correspond to men later identified as Ragnar's sons. But they do not give us the complete revenge story familiar from the later sagas. Those traditions developed centuries afterward. Ragnar himself sits somewhere in the fog between history and legend. So Ivar, Halfdan, and Ubba may have been members of the same Scandinavian warrior dynasty. They may even have regarded themselves as sons of a famous Ragnar. But the idea that the invasion of 865 was simply a revenge mission for Ragnar's death is something we should treat as legend rather than established history. The Vikings didn't need a legendary blood feud to have reasons for invading England. There was land, there was wealth, and increasingly there was opportunity. After taking Northumbria, the Great Army turned south. Then East Anglia fell. Mercia was under enormous pressure. Only one major kingdom still had the strength to resist: Wessex. In 870 and 871, the Vikings moved into Wessex territory. A frantic series of battles followed. One of the West Saxon commanders was a young prince named Alfred, the same man history would remember as Alfred the Great. But this was not yet Alfred's triumph. His brother, King Æthelred, died in 871. Alfred inherited the throne with Viking armies operating inside his kingdom, and the Great Army was still moving. In 878, a new Viking leader, Guthrum, renewed the attack on Wessex. He launched a surprise offensive that drove Alfred into hiding in the marshes of Somerset. For a moment, it must have seemed that Wessex would follow Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Instead, Alfred rebuilt his forces. Later that year, the two armies met at Edington. This time, the West Saxons won. Guthrum eventually accepted baptism, and a political settlement followed. The Vikings had failed to conquer all of England, but they had permanently transformed it. And perhaps that is why the legend of Ragnar's sons became so powerful. People looking backwards saw an extraordinary historical event, an army appearing from across the sea, ancient kingdoms collapsing one after another, kings dying, being overrun and overthrown, and Scandinavian rulers taking their place. Such an invasion demanded an equally extraordinary explanation. So history remembered Ivar, Halfdan, and Ubba. Legend gave them a father, Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether they really invaded England to avenge him, we may never know, but the army they led was real. And in 865, it began one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of England.